So that reading from Deuteronomy, it tells us there are two options. There are two choices, only two roads before you. There's prosperity over here and adversity over here. Blessings or curses, life or death. Choose life. It reminds me from the scene from Liar, Liar, a Jim Carrey movie back in the 90s. Anyone remember that movie? Yeah. So there's this scene, this scene in that movie where Jim Carrey he's a defense attorney and he can no longer tell a lie. And so the secretary comes to him and says, I've got one of your clients on the phone. And he was arrested sticking up another ATM. He needs some legal advice. So Jim Carrey picks up the phone and says, stop breaking the law! And gives the phone back. That's it, right? That's the only legal advice you ever need. Stop breaking the law. Just follow the laws. Follow God's laws, and your life will be fine. And that may sound legal advice, a good place to start with, but we know that life isn't always that simple. It doesn't always work that way. And actually, sometimes unintentionally, we end up following this idea in our head that the more we follow God, the more faithful people we are, the better our lives will be, the more blessings we have, and bad things won't happen to us. But actually, that idea can be pretty damaging when it's taken too far because life doesn't always work that way. And actually, we see many places in the Bible that show us that, no, that's not how God works. Look at things like the book of Job or the book of Ecclesiastes, many of Jesus' encounters with people. No, we're not always punished or rewarded. That's not always what happens in our lives. So if you hear this passage and you start to wonder, what was it that I did to make God punish me or to punish my loved ones, you can stop right there because that's not how God works. That's not what this passage is talking about. It's not meant to fill us with fear or guilt. It's meant to give us hope, to inspire us that no matter what has happened in the past, no matter how much of a mess we've made out of things or the people before us have made out of things, no matter what's happened, we get to play a role in shaping our future. We are not entirely powerless. We get to make choices every day, and those choices matter. We can choose to live in a way that is life-giving for those around us. We can make choices that makes this world a better place now and in the future. We can choose life. When you look at Deuteronomy as a whole, it's written as one long speech or one long sermon from Moses. And there are just a little over 23,000 words in Hebrew in Deuteronomy, and the average person speaks between 100 and 200 words per minute, which means when you add that up, this would have been a 2 to 4 hour sermon. So if you're starting to complain that our sermons get too long, I just want you to know it could be a lot worse, folks, okay? Although we are reminded that Moses died right after this speech, so that's a little different. They couldn't really do much to him at that point, right? But this whole farewell sermon, this 2 to 4 hour speech from Moses, is given to the people of Israel when they're about to enter the promised land. Right? They had been wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years after they were freed from slavery in Egypt, and they're finally here. But what happens when they get into that promised land? Well, first of all, there's the slight problem that there are other people already living in the land, and so there's this very difficult passage of the Bible, this period of battles and conquest, which is a whole other can of worms for a 3-hour sermon for some other day. But eventually, they get there. Right? Eventually, they make it their home. But even then, this coalition of tribes of Israel, they're not very stable or secure. They're always threatened by the people around them. And then they start to see, hey, wait a minute, there are powerful nations out there. We want to be like them. If we were a strong, wealthy nation, then we wouldn't have to worry about losing what we have. We could hold on to it. We could expand our power, have more land. We want to be a kingdom. And to be a kingdom, you have to have a king. And God tells them from the beginning, no, don't go down that path. You don't need a king. I don't want you to have a king. I am supposed to be your king. But they don't listen. Right? Remember, all the way back to Abraham, God was telling the people, you are supposed to be a light to the nations. You're supposed to be a blessing to the world. Not just looking out for yourselves. You're not supposed to be like everyone else. And the whole point of bringing them out of Egypt was so that things would be different than they were in Egypt. So that with God's people, no one has to suffer as slaves or victims of the empire. And God knew that by having a king, that would lead them down that path to try and become a kingdom like Egypt. It's not what God wanted for them. But they wouldn't listen. They insisted on becoming a monarchy, and so they did. Now notice this, though. Just because they turned down the wrong path, they did exactly what God told them not to do, God still didn't abandon them. God stayed with them even while they were making these wrong choices. And during this whole period of the kings, there was this Game of Thrones type drama. All this craziness and drama was going on and ups and downs. But eventually, the nation of Israel started to get what they wanted in having a king. They had some power. They had some wealth. And this power and wealth, it grew. And during the reign of Solomon, King Solomon, that power and wealth kind of peaked there. They got to build this kingdom on the backs of slaves. They got to have war horses and chariots, just like Egypt did. And the Old Testament prophets tell us that during this time of the monarchy, the people of God were turning away from God. And that doesn't just mean that they weren't going to church enough. Actually, listen to what the prophet Amos says. Switch to that side, please. Thank you. I despise your festivals, your religious festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I don't want to hear your hymns or your praise and worship. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. See, the prophets tell us that God is not interested in our worship. God is not interested in our worship if we're not doing justice and making the world a just place. And then Jeremiah speaks of what this kind of justice looked like. For if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly with one another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. See, Israel got what they wanted. They had a king, they had a powerful kingdom, but they weren't being who God wanted them to be. They weren't taking care of the vulnerable. Instead, they were acting just like Egypt. And what happens in the ancient world when you start to play those power games? When you start to play with empires? Well, if there's someone else around you that's bigger and stronger than you are, well, at some point, they're going to take your power. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. It started with the Assyrian Empire, and then the Babylonian Empire finished the job. They conquered the people of Israel, and they took away their leaders to live in Babylon in exile for 50 years. And after those 50 years were up, they were able to go back home. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm going into the entire history of the Old Testament. Or maybe not. I go on tangents a lot. But you may be wondering what this has to do with Deuteronomy. Well, you have to understand this larger story arc of the Bible to get what's going on here. You see, the book of Deuteronomy, like everything in the Bible, it started being passed down as oral tradition. Imagine it. If Moses was giving a 2 to 4 hour sermon, there was no one there transcribing it word for word onto clay tablets. That didn't happen. They didn't have a tape recorder. No, what happened was that people shared what they remembered, and they told their children and their children's children. That kept being passed on generation to generation. And eventually, all those oral accounts were written down, and then that was edited and compiled into something like what we have in Deuteronomy today. You see, but that process of compiling and editing didn't take place until at least the exile, when all of that stuff I described had already happened. Which means that the first people to hear Deuteronomy in the form that we have it today, they already knew all the things that happened to their ancestors after they entered the land. So you can bet they were asking a lot of difficult questions. Questions like, what does it matter if I follow God anyway? Why should I trust this God? I mean, look at what happened to our ancestors. They went into that land, they had a kingdom, and then they were conquered. All of it was taken away. Does it really matter, the choices that we make, when there are all these powers at work far beyond our control? Does any of it really matter? And this is where Deuteronomy speaks to us. God speaks to us in Deuteronomy that yes, what you do, the choices you make, they matter. They matter for you and for your children and for your children's children. And look at your ancestors. Sometimes they made good choices, but other times they didn't. They turned down that other path that leads to death. And there were consequences of the choices that they made that affected them and that affected the next generation all the way down to you. So what Deuteronomy reminds us, just like it reminded the people in exile, is that we have those same choices set before us. And we ask ourselves the same kind of difficult questions that the people in exile asked. Does anything that we do actually matter? Does it make a difference? I mean, I want to be a disciple of Jesus. I want to spread light into the world. But sometimes I think the little that I can do, how could that ever make an impact? So maybe I shouldn't just bother doing anything at all. Do you ever feel that way? We know that God wants us to be good stewards of this world, which means taking care of our planet. But does it really matter what my carbon footprint is, or how much waste I use, or if I recycle or compost? All of that is just a drop in the bucket anyway. And we know that part of what it means to practice justice and compassion is to engage in political and civic life, in voting and advocating for things that take care of the poor. But let's be real. In this crazy world, does my voice or my vote actually make a difference? With all the things that are going on in this world, all the tragedies, all the injustice, all the greed, does any of our choices actually matter? And God tells us today, yes, they do. And did you notice how our reading started? See, I have set before you today. Right here, right now, there are choices to make. Life and prosperity or death and adversity. So choose life, people. Now know this. God stays with us no matter what choices we make. Because there are going to be times where we turn down the wrong path, where we do the wrong thing. And God loves us no matter what. God is still there with us. But those times when we choose the right path, when we choose to follow God, we can do something good in the world. We get to choose life for our world here and now. Today, for God's Work Our Hands Sunday, there are several different service projects that we're taking part in as a church. So one of them, we're collecting these hygiene kits for LSS Choices, which help victims of domestic violence. We're also going around to stock food in the little food pantries that our kids in Sunday school are going to put together, those lunch kits. And we're cutting jeans to make shoes for people in Uganda. Now, even if we have outstanding, great participation in all of these things, we're not going to solve any of these problems today, not by ourselves anyway. We can't provide all the resources for people who are victims of domestic violence, or all the hungry, or everyone who needs shoes. But every person who is helped today, every life that is impacted by what we do matters. It makes a difference. And also, today is a special day because we know that we are joined by thousands of other Lutherans in the ELCA who are serving their communities in their own ways. So we can be sure that today, at least, what we're doing will make a difference. It will make an impact. But what we have to remember is that's true every day. Every day, all of our choices, they make a difference. Even the small acts that we never get to see what fruit comes from them, even our small acts of following God and spreading love, they make a difference. We get to choose life in the world. So I'm going to end this sermon time today by sharing a short video with you, and this uses a prayer from Martin Luther King. This is a prayer for the church. I think it's fitting for us, and it's fitting for this sermon. So we end today with this prayer.